afternoon and a very warm welcome to this online event of the Radix Center for Business, Politics and Society. For those who do not know us yet, Radix CBPS is a think tank and a platform, and we focus on aligning public policy with responsible business. And we are part of the Radix network that includes Radix in the UK and Politica, the Radix Youth Network. This afternoon, we will discuss two recently published books that both look at how business leaders can respond to the rapidly changing expectations of businesses and to ensure long-term and sustainable business success. And it's an honor for me to now introduce Alison Jones, our moderator of this afternoon. Alison is founder of Practical Inspiration Publishing, a pioneering publishing partner for businesses. She's the host for the Extraordinary Business Book Club, a podcast and community for writers and readers of extraordinary business books. And she's also the head of the Business Book Awards and has written and edited several books. Most recently, This Book Means Business. Alison, over to you.
Thanks, Ron, and welcome from me too. Very good to be here and to be chairing this extraordinary event. So let me just explain the format. I'm going to introduce our speakers and put a few questions to them for discussion for 25 minutes or so. And after that, there will be time for questions from the floor. So please do, as we go, put your questions in the chat as they occur to you, and then we will come back to them towards the end. So I'm going to begin by introducing our panel for today. I'm delighted to be joined by three extraordinary speakers and authorities in this field. We have Professor David Grayson, CBE, who is Emeritus Professor of Corporate Responsibility at Cranfield School of Management and Chair at the Institute of Business Ethics, and he is co-author of the Sustainable Business Handbook. Gail Klintworth is Board Chair at GlobeScan, the Shell Foundation and Integrity Action, amongst other NED and board advisory roles. She was formerly Chief Sustainability Officer at Unilever. And finally, Joe Zammit-Lucia, an entrepreneur, investor, and co-founder of the Radix think tanks and the Centre for Business, Politics and Society. And Joe is the author of The New Political Capitalism: How Businesses and Societies Can Thrive in a Deeply Politicized World. So welcome to all three of you. Thank you for joining us today. And let me begin by putting a question to you, Joe. One of the reviews of your book says that it captures a seismic change in the relations between politics and business. And I thought that was a really interesting phrase. So can you just tell us a little bit about what that seismic change is and its implications for business? Joe?
Okay, good. I've unmuted. So, you know, throughout the kind of latter part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, we lived through a period of time where the window of, let's call it the battle of political ideas, was relatively narrow. We had convinced ourselves that kind of the market-driven, laissez-faire, neoliberal political framework was the only thing there was. I mean, if you take the UK as an example, we went through over 20 years through Margaret Thatcher and then Tony Blair, which some people could describe as Thatcherism with a bigger grin. There was really not a big battle of political ideas. It was the same at the geopolitical level. You know, liberal democracy had won the battle of ideas. Communism had failed. You know, the wall had come down, the Soviet Union had collapsed. And here we were, you know, China was supposed to be going inevitably into democracy as it developed, you know, and we all convinced ourselves that it was the end of history. There was really not a battle for political ideas. So business could focus on making money. It didn't have to engage because there was no battle of political ideas. Well, that has all changed and changed very dramatically. And, you know, the latest Russia-Ukraine war is the slap in the face that has woken us up to changes that have been going on for 20 years. I suggest they started with 9/11, where, you know, geopolitics changed. We had Georgia, Afghanistan, we had Chechnya, we had the great financial crash, which made it clear to everybody that our assumptions on the stability and kind of utopic delusion of our political economy was actually that, a delusion. China changed dramatically with President Xi coming to power, becoming much more totalitarian, much more assertive in geopolitical terms, using commercial and trade tools as an instrument of coercion, if you like, of other countries. So the world today is dramatically different from that relatively brief period of when we thought it was all rosy. And, you know, at that time, business could just get on with making money. Well, now the battle of political ideas is back, and it's back with a vengeance, both at the geopolitical level and at the national level, where we see increasing polarization of politics, of the political actors, let's put it that way, where business is getting dragged into taking a stand, as they put it, on all sorts of things that they didn't really have to consider before or speak out about. And frankly, they still have to learn how to handle that. It's difficult, it's challenging, there are no easy answers, but the world in which business operates has changed dramatically. And the idea that business, which was always a delusion, that business is somehow apolitical, is now well and truly out of the window.
Thanks, Joe. And I think that point that trade has always been a tool of politics is well taken as well. The two have always been put together. Gail, can I invite you to comment on that? Do you share that point that businesses can't just focus on making money anymore?
Well, I don't know if they ever could. So I think they were perhaps a little, those that thought they were very myopic. I think probably what has changed now is, you know, previously you had some businesses that said, I will do my business and then I will operate in a responsible way and I will do CSR to have a broader impact, right? Then if we went into a phase where businesses went, right, I really understand the big issues out there, I will try and, you know, shift my portfolio, whatever, to meet the needs of people that are created by things that aren't necessarily in their own control. So whether it be climate change, water, etc. So businesses said we would do that. I think where we are now, and I'm not only talking global business, I'm also talking local business. I think what's happening on the geopolitical stage and what's happening in the kind of broader external impacts are so significant that you can't just do the CSR, but you can't just look after your own stuff and you can't just make money, right? You have to kind of engage, even if you're only engaging on, for example, shifting your global supply chain from global to more, but that also becomes a geopolitical issue. So, you know, if we ever thought that these pieces of the economy, these players in the economy were siloed, but every now and then linked, I think what we're beginning to see is we're so interwoven that we need to really understand how we play the broad piano of possibilities.
That's a lovely metaphor, thank you. And David, I'm just going to invite you in here as well. I mean, Gail's assessment there of how CSR has evolved from a kind of add-on to something that is so fundamental to how business operates. I know that that's something that you can speak to as well.
So very much, I come at all of this from the perspective of how do businesses really embed a commitment to sustainability? In other words, to take responsibility for reducing their negative social and environmental and economic impacts, and to find ways of increasing their opportunities for maximizing their positive social, environmental, and economic impacts. And I think from that perspective, then for companies, once they have started to deal with the basics of embedding sustainability, then speaking out and speaking up for policies that will advance, for instance, action on the climate emergency, or for policies and activities which will promote more diversity and equity and inclusion, then those become part of the toolkit for a sustainable business. And so both in the last book that I wrote with my two co-authors, Chris Coulter and Mark Lee, all in about the future of business leadership, and now in the most recent one, the Sustainable Business Handbook, in each case, we have chapters in both of those books about what we call advocacy, speaking out, speaking up for sustainable development and social justice, and being advocates for policies and programs that will advance those goals. I think what Joe and Gail are identifying is that the climate in which those sustainable business leaders can speak out, and I think are increasingly expected to speak out. Larry Fink, in his letter to CEOs in January this year, said that this was not, and I quote, woke capitalism, that this was part of fiduciary duty. And I think it is part of fiduciary duty for investors to express what they expect of well-run businesses. And it's part of those well-run businesses to speak out and speak up. The challenge now is, and I disagree at all with Joe's analysis, is that it's just got a whole lot harder, because overlaid on those debates around sustainable development and social justice are now these questions about so-called woke capitalism. And I think, how do businesses, particularly in the United States, but I don't think we will sadly be able to escape it in Europe either, and certainly not in the UK probably, how do businesses navigate this increasingly treacherous waters of the so-called culture wars and all that goes with that?
It is a really good question, and it leads me to a question I think about responsibility at the senior leadership level, because you were talking about CEOs there, we're talking about business leaders, and I've got a question I want to put to Gail initially, but I'd love your perspectives on it afterwards, Joe and David, which is, what is the balance of accountability, of responsibility? What is the role of executive leadership, and what's the role of the board in these kinds of conversations and discussions and policy making?
So, I mean, we know that depending on where you are geographically, but we know that in many cases, in many countries, the executive leadership team really has to navigate its business through the current and future turmoil, right? So that means, you know, whatever you have to do around opportunity and risk, wherever it's created, is absolutely, it's your job, right? Within that is the concept of broad stakeholder capitalism. So, you know, it is, you're not only selling widgets, you're selling widgets to people within a particular environment, and an environment that is, you know, as we all know the term VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and will continue to be so. So that's, now from a board perspective, right, you've got, I guess, even an even greater vantage point of and responsibility of steering this organization in terms of future risks, not only current risks, right? And you know, fortunately, in the US, as you know, there's been this huge debate around whether board members have primarily a responsibility only to shareholders, or whether it broadens. Well, you know, it's been now put forward in one of the latest movements, that in fact it is the broader shareholder base, which stakeholder base, which is great. Whether that's actually playing out yet, I'm not sure. So I think that's where it is. I think the part that, and as David mentioned, the part that we have to really differentiate is, between, I think risk and opportunity are the two words I want to use, right? So what are risks now and what are risks in the future? What are risks that are created by geopolitical situations or by cultural trends or by, whether you call it wokeness, right? Are those things that are going to fundamentally hurt your business, in which case you need to be really clear about what you're going to do about it. And that's across all spheres, right? So that would be in your engagement advocacy, as well as what you're doing in your business with your employees. Or is it a real opportunity that you can authentically grab hold of, right? And I think the authentically grab hold of part is really important, because, I'm not big on the let's speak up, let's speak out, let's speak up, let's speak out, unless you're doing something. Because, I think that's where businesses start puffing themselves up to the point where actually it's what they're saying is irrelevant and they get into trouble.
Yeah, it's very easy to start greenwashing, isn't it, and make this a PR exercise. David, what are your thoughts on that balance between managing the short-term interests of the business with the long-term, and that balance between executive and non-executive leadership?
So I think we need to differentiate between traditional corporate lobbying, which very often is quite short-term, is typically looking for some advantage, maybe just for the particular business, or maybe for its particular trade sector, a tax break, some relief from regulatory expectations, etc., but which is essentially quite selfish and short-term, versus what people like the Harvard Business Review and The Economist have called CEO activism, which in my book is where an individual CEO is using his or her position as a CEO to push forward a point of view which is their personal point of view, and they're getting more PR for it because of the virtue of the role that they play. I would differentiate between those items, traditional lobbying and CEO activism, and what I'm talking about in terms of advocacy, which has to be linked, as Gail rightly says, to authentic performance and track record. And I think there are some simple tests, and this is not original to me. It comes from a professor in the United States, Professor Paul Argenti at Dartmouth College, who says there's a kind of 3-question test that you might apply. First of all, before we decide if we are going to be advocates on a particular issue, does this relate back to our corporate purpose and our strategy? So can we explain why we believe we have a locus on a particular issue? So, for example, Unilever encouraging other businesses to commit to the living wage is authentic because they themselves 2 years ago made the commitment that over the coming decade, they're going to pay the living wage through their own workforce and through their supply chain. So first question, says Argenti, is it consistent with our core purpose and strategy, so we can explain why we are taking the stand that we're taking? Question 2, he says, is can we make a significant difference on this issue by being an advocate for it, either on our own or typically in partnership, in collaboration with others through a corporate responsibility coalition or a trade association, etc. And then thirdly, Argenti says, will our stakeholders approve of it? I think I would modify that slightly and say, will our stakeholders at least understand, if they don't always personally quite approve, of why we are taking up this cause, why we are being an advocate in these circumstances. So that, I think, starts to differentiate it clearly from the self-interest or the short-term or the individual. Perhaps Joe might pick up the other question about the role of execs and non-execs. Happy to pick that up later if not.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. And yes, Joe, coming to you on that really, and also perhaps that point about personality politics versus authentic advocacy.
Yes.
Any thoughts on that?
So I like to distinguish between two things, between companies being political and companies being activist. And you can call it activist or advocacy or whatever, but the two are fundamentally different, because politics is the process through which we find a way forward in society while recognizing that society is full of people with fundamentally different opinions. So if you want to be a political company, and this is a choice, then you have to recognize that your stakeholders, your shareholders and everybody else is a muddle of fundamentally different opinions, different moral perspectives, different views. And the question is, the political skill is to ask the right questions in that context and to find a political way forward among this cacophony. Being activist is quite different. Being activist is what people call taking a stand, which means in this diverse pluralistic society, I'm going to pick a side. Okay? And that is quite a different choice to make. And companies can go there if they wish, but they don't have to go there if they have the political skills to handle these things politically. What we're seeing, I think, is many companies who don't have those skills are being dragged by the nose by the loudest voices, by the activists out there who say, you must take my side. And because they make a lot of noise, they succumb. My thought about the role of executive teams and about non-executives, etc., is that going forward, these sorts of questions are going to be the primary thing that senior management and non-executive boards have to focus on. Because corporations have 1 million people who know how to run their operations. There's nothing new about that. All that can be delegated. It's not actually very difficult to look at financial accounts. There's lots of people who can do that. So senior management can delegate all that further down the organization. But what they can't delegate is managing to be political and choosing whether they want to be activist. And I agree with what David has just said. Nobody's surprised when a company like Patagonia decides it's going to be activist on climate change, because that's part of the DNA of the corporation. But in the US now, we have this rather fiery, highly emotional debate on abortion rights. And if companies start wading into that and taking a side without any kind of anchor in who they are as a company, why are they taking this side and not that side when their stakeholders are ranged, across the whole spectrum? That's quite a different thing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's very interesting when your identity isn't at all bound up with the activism and you're layering it on top. That's really interesting. And you said something that I thought was very interesting there as well. You said that the operations can be delegated. They have 1 million people to do this stuff. So a question for David, which I'd be interested in all of your takes on as well. But David, I'm going to come to you first, because I know from our conversation that you've been talking to small businesses as well. How does this play out in small businesses where there aren't 1 million people to carry on the other stuff? In a sense, they are more free to take a side because there's fewer people to herd together. But in another sense, they have to just do the day job.
Well, before I answer this specific point about small businesses, which I think is really important, but I just want to build on something that Joe said. people on our webinar today or watching it later on may think we are disagreeing. Actually, I think we're using some words in a slightly different meaning, which may sound on the surface as if we are disagreeing, but actually I think we're probably quite ferociously agreeing with each other, because I am drawing a clear distinction, and I don't want to get into boring semantics, but I think it is important, this distinction between the activism and an advocating from a position as part of core purpose and strategy and commitment to embedding sustainability. And that, I think, is then seeing advocacy as a further tool in the toolkit. I totally agree with Joe on any of these issues where business leaders on behalf of their businesses are being asked to effectively to explain what their position is, because they can't avoid it. Businesses, for example, have not been able to avoid since February the 24th. If you are doing business in Russia, what is your stance in relation to the Putin aggression? You cannot avoid that. And I think in that sense, Joe's absolutely right. Business is inherently political in that sense. I think what Joe is saying is that businesses increasingly are going to need the skills, whether we call it public affairs for the 2020s, or whether we call it sophisticated external affairs and stakeholder engagement. But businesses are going to have to pay a lot more attention to this, and it will require careful oversight by boards, as well as execution by executive teams. When it comes to small businesses, again, looking at this from the perspective of advocacy for sustainability, I think small businesses do, in one sense, have an advantage, because they have a smaller span of control and activity, and therefore they can be surer that if they are becoming an advocate, that their actual behavior day in, day out is consistent with what they are advocating. And I'm quite fascinated by the way that a number of even small businesses, particularly those that have become a B or benefit corporation, certified by B Lab, whether it's B Lab Europe or B Lab USA or B Lab UK, etc., how these B corporations in particular are using their status as a B Corp to be able to explain why they think that further action is required on the climate emergency or on diversity, equity and inclusion and so on. I do think, again, in the US context, businesses are going to have to engage, particularly, well, I think across the political spectrum, but it's particularly at the moment, it seems, Republican lawmakers, both at state level and at the federal level, who are threatening companies that if they do speak out, that they will suffer all kinds of penalties, whether it's Disney, where tax breaks, patent protection, status of their self-governing local authority around Disney World and so on, have all been brought into question, or whether it's threats to corporate executives where they are saying that they will fund staff to travel out of state where abortion is being effectively banned. And this is part of the whole extra dimensions that any business doing business in the US today, large or small, is going to have to navigate with incredible care around these culture wars.
I think I'd like to come back to the culture wars. If nobody has a question on that, I might land one in there in a moment, but I'm conscious of time. Joe, perhaps you'd like to speak to that question. Well, you might want to answer David's point about what he means by advocacy, but also that small, large business distinction? What do you see as the risks and the opportunities there?
I think David is absolutely right. You know, to some extent, small businesses are shielded in that they don't have such a big social footprint. So you know, people don't kind of go to them immediately like they would go to a Disney or to an Exxon or to whatever. But they're not immune from these pressures. I mean, I have a friend of mine whose business essentially had to be closed down. She had to close it down because she came under attack from racial equality activists. And she actually had to close the business down. And she had to close the business down, not because of what was happening, but largely because she was incapable of dealing with it, because it's very difficult. So you know, nobody's immune, but different, and there's no such thing as business. So you know, there are multiple businesses and different types of businesses, and everybody will have to find the way of navigating it for themselves. One of the issues, I think, for large businesses that makes being political quite difficult, again, political as navigating multiple opinions and being sensitive about that, is that that is not the traditional persona of the CEO of a large business. The traditional persona of the CEO of the large business is the omniscient Superman. It's the person who knows how to make the right decision always. And the idea of navigating multiple opinions, particularly on things that may be considered ethical or moral issues or whatever, doesn't come naturally to people who have got to that position, because it's not what got them to that position. It's not what's been expected of them once they're in that position. So they frankly don't have those skills, you know, through no fault of their own. They've not been bred for it. So it's going to be, you know, quite a challenge, I think, to handle that. And Gail, I think, has probably seen this firsthand.
Well, I'll come to you. I think that's a great point, and perhaps it also speaks to what we as followers need from our leaders and need to sort of accept in our leaders as well. But Gail, over to you.
Okay, so you know, the business leader's diplomat, I think, is the sort of headline here. So I do think that, you know, we talk about, I'm not talking sustainability leaders per se, I'm talking them as well as executives, need to have a conceptual flexibility and an empathy antenna that can begin to really understand what's going on and where you want to lead the organization within. I think Joe used the word cacophony of opinions, statements, issues, collaborations, conventions, you know, whatever you want to call it, right? I want to just come back to action, right? Because one of the things that concerns me enormously at the moment is something that within the world of sustainable business, but also, you know, in the general world, there's this little muddle that says, if we say something, it's done, right? Or if you express an opinion, then you've moved something. Or if you like something, you've done your bit, right? And I think it's extremely important that we understand that's not the case, right? I would much rather have a whole lot of businesses, and in fact, a whole lot of governments, if that were possible, doing some things that are really going to help us solve the challenges that are facing us around climate change, social inequity, and all the rest combined, than talking about it. And, you know, if I just, let me just give you a couple of stats here, right? So climate change, right? heard it done to death. We've got every country in the world publishing INDCs. We've got every major company in the world publishing net zero, etc. That's all fabulous. Right now, the gap on the pathway to 1.5 degrees is so significant that it's virtually the same as what we can still burn in the next. So, you know, if we think that standing up in a couple of platforms and talking about it is going to solve it, that's not going to happen, right? The same if we talk about social inequity, and those are the two really, really big issues facing us as a world, right? Similarly, if we talk about social inequity, you know, quite frankly, until such a time as we address unemployment in much of the world, you know, in our own country and more broadly, living wages, the ability of people to adapt to what's going on, right? So adapt to climate change. We're all just playing a game of, I don't know, articulate. And so, you know, I would really, that's why I do love the two books that we're discussing here, right? So the Sustainable Business Handbook is a handbook how to, you know, begin to shift your business to become more sustainable. And the New Political Capitalism book is around how we understand that there's no business separate to politics and how it's all interwoven and how you have to, you know, operate within that to take action. But it has to be to take action, because otherwise, what are you doing and why are you doing it, right? So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
No, and it's a great point on which to end this part of the thing. It's all about action. And I think it's great to bring us back to that reminder that business can be a force for good. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about actually making a difference in the world. Wonderful. Well, thank you all very much. That was fantastic to listen to from my perspective. At the moment, there aren't any questions in the chat, which is great for me because I've got a few that I can ask. But if anybody who's listening has a question that they would like to put to the panel, now is your moment. While we wait for you to take action on that, I'm just going to come back to that point about media, about transparency, about culture wars, because I think it is a really, really interesting one. And of course, I can't remember who made it now. But David, since you've unmuted yourself, I'm going to leap upon you and say, what do you think? And again, we were talking about risks and opportunities as though they're different things. Of course, they're the same side of you know, two sides of the same coin. What are the issues around that business leaders really need to take on board?
So I think there is probably immediately a different situation in the United States versus for those of us here in Europe at the moment. And I do think there may well be a really interesting role for Radix to try and host a transatlantic debate around some of these questions, because for me, it seems absurd that seemingly most of the Republican lawmakers are seeing these advocates for stakeholder capitalism and for action on sustainability as somehow anti-conservative, when it's profoundly conservative in the sense of conserving, of wanting to conserve our planet, wanting to conserve our future, wanting to conserve a harmonious society. So I think there has to be some proactive discussion and some real kind of stimulus thought leadership with some of the opinion formers on the right of US politics to try to break out of what at the moment feels like absolute trench warfare around questions of Roe v. Wade repeal, around issues of LGBTQ plus debates, around issues to do with climate emergency and so on. Yeah. So I personally think that there is a role to try and stimulate some constructive thought leadership around some of these questions in relation to the culture wars already in place in the USA. Secondly, when it comes to different parts of Europe, and I look first of all to the country I know best, the UK, where I personally think it is the height of irresponsibility for any politician for very short term, very silly personal political objectives to try and stoke up culture wars which do not yet exist to anywhere near the intensity of the USA. So I think we should all be trying to call out spurious attempts to create a culture war in the United Kingdom when it doesn't exist, and to try to challenge those who, by their naivety, by their frankly sometimes silliness, they are contributing to creating the wood that might soon burn. I don't see it quite in the same way in some of the continental European countries, although the whole populist right debate could well lead that way as well.
Yes, it's so entrenched with the stories that we tell ourselves, the narratives that people build around them, and our sense of identity, isn't it? It's very flammable stuff. Gail, do you want to come in and add anything to that?
Well, I was going to say, David, I don't know if it's always silliness that drives it, right? I think it's greed and ambition. And, you know, while people might not be sensible to the unintended consequences, the drive for it is greed and ambition. And, you know, I tend to spend a lot of time in countries where we don't have, I guess, the sophisticated democratic systems that we have in the UK. And I don't know, I watched the march on the Capitol last night, and I'm going, I don't know about sophisticated democratic systems really. But, you know, if I look at what's happening in Sri Lanka now, right? I mean, that is a fascinating situation. So you've got Sri Lanka, the Philippines, some of the Koreas, etc., who are all experiencing, quite frankly, there's a cultural war component to it. In fact, an ethical cultural war component to it. But so much of it is driven by leadership's poor behavior and stupidity in terms of thinking that we can do this on our own. And I think that is, and I'm not going to get into politics around the UK, but this move into your own garden that we're beginning to see around the world, which is also, I think, something relevant in the US, is potentially very damaging to a number of the issues that we have to handle, because people suddenly discover they can't do it all in their own garden. And then, you know, you've created a whole lot of unintended consequences. So yes, and I think it's the same with business leaders, right? I mean, all leaders have an enormous responsibility to you know, take the action that they need to take for their business that they can, but also to understand that what they do has an impact beyond what they ever imagined if they're not careful. Yeah.
I'm going to just share with you all a question from the floor. So we've had a couple. Ron, you're going to speak at the end, so I'm going to give you a chance later. So I'm going to pick up on Oliver MacArthur's question, which I think is a terrific one. What would be the best arguments to push back against critics of the sustainability agenda? We've seen some near-term weakness of sustainable investment strategies over the last 6 months, and already critics are calling it all as a fad. So Joe, I'm going to just turn to you first on that one, because I'm aware that you didn't answer the last question.
So I think there isn't a best argument, because you have multiple audiences, and arguments and discussions and engagement needs to play to the different audiences that you're talking to. So I think if we pull back a little bit and go back a few years or decades, you know, the environmental movement was not particularly sophisticated initially in how it pushed its agenda. A lot of its proposed solutions were based on very heavy statist intervention. And that alienated people who are on the center right or on the right. And as a result of that, it then became an identity issue. So these things develop over quite long periods of time. So in terms of the best arguments, it depends who you're appealing to. The other part of the question is that we're having pushback, and you've seen, I think, some of you may have seen recently, this new investment fund that's been launched by this guy Ramaswamy, I think is his name, and Bill Ackman, etc., saying, you know, businesses should just be businesses, and the coal company is just a good coal company, as though there's a single definition of what a good coal company is. But, you know, I wouldn't worry about those things, because progress is not linear. You know, there's always reactionary reactions to any kind of change. And you have to tack this way and that, and sometimes you take on water, and sometimes you get pushed back. It doesn't matter. The long-term trajectory around sustainability, etc., is unstoppable. But that doesn't mean it's going to be nice, neat, linear. Everybody's going to agree with us. And how couldn't they possibly agree with us? You know, that's just, you know, delusion. And to some extent in business, when you think of your way forward, the tendency is to draw a straight line and say, we want to get from place A to place B. You know, what's the quickest and most efficient way of doing it? Let's put in the investments and let's go there. But that's not how society progresses. It's not how society evolves. It's messy. It's a muddle. It's pushing this way and that, you know, 2 steps forward if we're lucky, only 2 steps back, but sometimes 4. We just have to accept that as the nature of progress.
So, well, I hope that's comforting, Oliver, that it's you should be expecting some pushback. Doesn't mean that anything's wrong. It probably means that actually people are taking notice, which is interesting. David, just before we finish on that question, would you like to, I'm sure you've had lots of experience in this, would you like to come in on that?
First of all, I agree so much with Joe's last points. I think they're really well made. And I certainly think if this is a fad, it's an almighty long fad, because I have seen waves of greater sophistication, greater sense of professionalization, and greater scope for the responsibilities of business over the last 40 plus years of my adult lifetime. So I think that actually when you have some of these contrarian funds like the Ackerman one that Joe was just mentioning, I think that's actually rather helpful, because it's grit in the oyster time. And we do need to be being challenged and pushed and so on. I think the combination of business arguments, again, this is not me, it's from people like Andrew Winston, a very successful sustainability consultant and very, very good author as well. He has talked about sort of embedding sustainability being in order to cut your costs, to make money, to reduce your risks, to build trust and grow the business. And I think those are the longer term arguments in favor of embedding sustainability, which I repeat again, is about taking responsibilities for your social and environmental and economic impacts. Can I just really quickly pick up Ron's question? Because Ron has actually just himself, he's too modest to say it, but he's just written and published through the INSEAD Corporate Governance Centre a really good paper on what are some of the different models that boards of companies can use to embed sustainability, and what are some of the obvious really good plugins, as he calls them, to help them to make progress. So if anyone is thinking about what do you do at board level to get better oversight of all of these issues around sustainability, including how you become, in Joe's language, politically savvy, in my language, a better advocate around these questions, then that report from the INSEAD Corporate Governance Centre would be a good place to start. And of course, the relevant chapter of the Sustainable Business Handbook too.
Absolutely. Well, and that let's end it there, because frankly we could go on all day and it would be absolutely fascinating, and I would love to do that, but we're going to have to start drawing it to a close. Do continue the conversation. As David says, check out Ron's NCR piece. Obviously look at these two books because they are extraordinary. Connect with the speakers, and don't let it end here. You know, I hope that it has been a really practical and useful session for you, as well as being stimulating and interesting. And don't forget to ask the questions in your organisation. I'm going to hand over to each of the panellists now, just for some closing remarks. If we were to take just one thing from this session, just in a couple of minutes, each of you, Gail, what should it be?
Don't think about this conversation as sustainability. Think about it as your business and the future of your business. And I think that is the conversation also that Oliver needs to be able to have with the boards. So as long as you're running something separate, it's always going to be seen as, you know, kind of a sideline. This is about risk and opportunity. And there just happened to be a couple of sustainability infused people that can help with that discussion, but it's about business.
Wonderful.
And politics, sorry, Joe, and politics, because it's all one.
Thank you, Gail. And I think it was probably David that said this to me once, but the argument about sustainability may be tough, but the argument for non-sustainability is a very, very bad one. So that's also useful to keep in mind. David, what would be your takeaway for everybody?
Gail, of course, is absolutely right. This is about ultimately making your business more resilient and about giving yourselves the best fighting chance of continuing into the indefinite future and doing so successfully. And I think it starts by understanding what are your really material impacts on those three pillars: social, environmental, and economic. And if you identify those, you will be in a much better place to understand what are the issues on which you might need Joe's political savviness to navigate.
Thank you, David. And Joe, over to you to finish us off. What are your takeaways for today?
So the one thing I would say is that quite often in this kind of debate at senior management level, we get asked the question, so what should my corporate governance structures be? How should I have corporate governance to deal with these issues? And I think there's a separate question which is more important than that, which you can't answer that question without answering the first question, which is, what are you governing for? What is the objective of your corporate governance? You know, what is your business there for and to achieve? And that's the question really that people have to reflect on these days. You know, what am I governing for? What is my business about? You know, why do I exist in this world? As a business, you know, would anybody give a damn if I disappeared from the face of the earth? So I think that, you know, we tend to focus very much immediately in corporations. You tend to go into, so what am I going to do about this? The question is, I think there's a prior question, which is, what are you doing it all for? And I think that it's time that people reflected on that a little bit more.
What a great first principle to take us back to close the session. Thank you, Joe. Thank you all. What a fantastic discussion.